No one noticed at first when the names began to disappear. A farmhand here, a widow there, a child sent away for spiritual correction. In rural Kentucky during the early 1800s, people vanished all the time, swallowed by disease, war, debt, or the wilderness itself. But this was different. These people all vanished from the same place, the same quiet religious settlement, and over the course of 27 years, 312 human beings entered that community and were never seen again. Tonight, on the Black Timeline, we uncover how faith became a weapon, obedience became a sentence, and silence became a grave. The silence that followed those vanished names did not begin with screams or blood or sudden catastrophe, but with promises, gentle ones, spoken softly across Kentucky's rolling hills in the early 19th century, where fear traveled faster than roads and faith was often the only shelter people believed they had left, and it was here, in this fragile borderland between wilderness and civilization, that the religious settlement later known as Hollow Grace first took root, presented to the world as a refuge rather than a warning, a sanctuary built not of stone at first but of words, sermons delivered beneath open skies by a man who called himself merely a servant of God, though others would come to call him Father Elijah, a preacher whose voice carried the steady calm of certainty and whose eyes reflected the conviction of someone who believed he had been chosen to correct a broken world, and to families devastated by crop failure, widows left adrift by war and illness, and laborers crushed by debt and isolation, his message felt less like doctrine and more like rescue, promising order where chaos ruled, community where loneliness had become unbearable, and divine protection at a time when death seemed arbitrary and relentless. And so they came, one by one, then in groups, walking or riding wagons along dirt paths that led deeper into the Kentucky interior, toward a clearing where a modest chapel stood surrounded by freshly cut timber and newly tilled soil, a place where rules were simple at first, prayers were frequent but comforting, and the idea of surrendering personal burdens to a collective faith felt like relief rather than loss. Because Hollow Grace did not initially ask for obedience, it offered belonging, and in those early days the settlement functioned like many frontier religious communities, with shared labor, communal meals, and sermons that emphasized humility and mutual responsibility, encouraging its members to renounce the selfishness of the outside world and embrace a purer way of living, one that rejected excess, vanity, and temptation, a philosophy that resonated deeply in a region where survival depended on cooperation and moral clarity. And yet, even then, beneath the surface of harmony, small shifts were occurring that would later define the community's descent. As Father Elijah spoke increasingly of separation rather than coexistence, warning his followers that the world beyond Hollow Grace was not merely flawed, but actively corrupt, poisoned by sin that could seep into the soul through casual contact, casual thought, casual doubt, and he urged them to limit outside communication, not as an act of control, but as spiritual hygiene, framing isolation as protection, a necessary barrier against moral decay, and while some hesitated, most complied, because fear is persuasive when dressed as care, and soon letters went unanswered. Visits grew rare, and the settlement began to turn inward, constructing its own rhythms, its own vocabulary, its own hierarchy, as Father Elijah established councils of elders chosen not by vote but by perceived spiritual strength, men and women who demonstrated absolute loyalty and unwavering acceptance of doctrine, people who repeated sermons word for word, who showed no curiosity about alternative interpretations, and who understood that obedience was not merely encouraged but admired, subtly rewarded with authority and proximity to leadership, and as Hollow Grace expanded, its physical growth mirrored its ideological tightening, with new structures rising in deliberate arrangement, homes facing inward toward the chapel, pathways designed to converge rather than lead outward, a symbolic geography that reinforced the idea that all answers, all safety, all meaning existed at the center. And it was during this period that the first unspoken rule took hold, one that would later shape every disappearance to come. The doubt was not a personal struggle, but a contagious illness. and those who expressed it were treated not as individuals with questions, but as threats to communal survival, leading to private corrections conducted by elders behind closed doors, sessions described publicly as prayer and guidance, but experienced by those inside as interrogations of belief, where confessions were expected, tears interpreted as progress, and silence viewed as resistance. And while most emerged shaken but compliant, changed in subtle ways that others noticed but did not discuss, a few did not emerge at all, their absence explained calmly from the pulpit as divine calling, as necessary separation, as a burden lifted from the community, language so carefully chosen that it smothered fear before it could take shape, because to question these explanations would require admitting that salvation might not be the only thing hollow grace was producing, and so the settlement continued to grow, drawing newcomers attracted by its reputation for discipline and spiritual clarity, unaware that entry marked a gradual erasure of self, as names were recorded less frequently, personal histories discouraged, and identity reduced to role and obedience, while Father Elijah's sermons grew increasingly apocalyptic, warning of impending judgment that only the truly faithful would survive, fostering an atmosphere where suffering became proof of devotion and endurance, a badge of righteousness. And in this environment, people learned to reinterpret pain as blessing, isolation as holiness, and silence as virtue, a psychological transformation that laid the groundwork for what would later be recognized as systematic disappearance, though at the time it felt merely like sacrifice, and by the time the first families outside Hollow Grace began to notice that letters had stopped entirely, that visits were refused, that familiar faces had vanished behind the settlement's gates, the community had already crossed a threshold from sanctuary to system, a place where leaving was not discussed, where obedience was measured not by action but by thought, and where the promise that once drew people in had quietly transformed into a sentence they did not yet know they were serving. And if this slow descent into control and silence grips you, if you feel the unease of history tightening its grip, now is the moment to subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon, and stay with us. Because this is only the beginning of Hollow Grace's secret, and what followed would claim not just faith, but lives, one quiet disappearance at a time. As Hollow Grace settled into its new identity as a place apart from the world, the changes that had once seemed gradual began to harden into structure, and structure into ritual, until daily life itself became an instrument of control so subtle that many no longer recognized it as such, because nothing appeared outwardly violent or chaotic, and that was precisely the danger, as mornings began with bells rung before dawn calling every soul to prayer, not optional, but framed as the natural rhythm of a righteous life, followed by communal labor assigned not by skill or preference, but by spiritual standing, with those deemed most faithful placed closest to the chapel and leadership, while those who had once expressed doubt, curiosity, or hesitation were quietly assigned to the outskirts, fields near the tree line, barns far from shared spaces, a physical marginalization that mirrored their social isolation. And though no one announced this hierarchy aloud, everyone understood it, because Father Elijah had mastered the art of implication, rarely issuing direct commands but instead weaving stories into sermons about biblical trials, about pruning the vine so that the fruit might grow stronger, metaphors that allowed the community to enforce discipline upon itself without ever needing explicit orders. And as months turned into years, this self-policing became second nature, neighbors watching neighbors, spouses listening carefully for dangerous thoughts, children learning early that questions carried consequences, and it was during this phase that the disappearances shifted from rare anomalies into an unspoken pattern, one that did not announce itself with panic, but revealed itself through absence, through empty beds at morning prayer, through work assignments quietly reassigned, through names no longer spoken aloud, and when asked, elders offered explanations that were always calm, always reasonable, always wrapped in the language of sacrifice, saying that Brother Thomas had been called to a distant mission, that Sister Eliza had chosen solitary devotion beyond the hills, that a family had been reassigned to prepare the way for the faithful elsewhere, and these explanations were accepted not because they were convincing, but because challenging them would require confronting a fear too large to name, the possibility that hollow grace was no longer a refuge but a trap, and fear, once internalized, does not scream, it whispers compliance, and compliance became the currency of survival within the settlement as people learned to measure every word, every expression, every hesitation, because those who were seen conferring too privately or lingering too long in thought were summoned for reflection, a process that had evolved far beyond prayer, involving days of isolation in small wooden rooms beneath the chapel where scripture was read aloud not to inspire but to exhaust, repeated until resistance softened into confession and confession into gratitude for correction. And while some emerged praising the process as transformative, others emerged hollow-eyed and silent, their personalities dulled, their independence extinguished, and a few never emerged at all, their names folded quietly into the growing list of called away, and it was around this time that the numbers began to matter, though no one inside Hollow Grace counted them openly, because the settlement maintained meticulous records of births, marriages, labor contributions, and spiritual evaluations, yet deaths were curiously absent from official logs, as if mortality itself had been edited out of existence, replaced by euphemism and omission, and this absence of death on paper created the illusion that Hollow Grace was untouched by the realities of human frailty, reinforcing Father Elijah's claim, true faith granted divine protection, even as bodies aged, injuries worsened, and illness spread quietly through communal quarters, treated not with medicine but with intensified prayer, because seeking outside help was considered a sign of spiritual weakness, a betrayal of trust in God's chosen leader, and so people suffered in silence, some recovering, others vanishing from sight under the pretense of spiritual retreat, and beyond the settlement's borders, rumors began to circulate among neighboring towns, whispered conversations in markets and churchyards about relatives who had joined Hollow Grace and were never heard from again, about letters returned unopened, about visitors turned away by armed guards who claimed the community was under spiritual quarantine. And while authorities initially dismissed these concerns as frontier paranoia or religious eccentricity, the sheer volume of missing persons reports slowly accumulated, not in a single dramatic wave, but as a steady trickle over decades, names added to ledgers, families left with no closure, no bodies, no official declarations of death, only the unsettling certainty that something was wrong, yet inside Hollow Grace, these outside concerns were reframed as persecution, with Father Elijah delivering increasingly fiery sermons, warning that the world would seek to destroy the faithful through lies and accusations, that Satan worked through government and family alike, urging followers to see any inquiry as proof that they were chosen, that their suffering was confirmation of righteousness, a powerful psychological inversion that transformed suspicion into validation, and it worked, deepening loyalty at precisely the moment when doubt might have saved lives, because the more the outside world questioned Hollow Grace, the more tightly the community closed ranks, fortifying boundaries, both physical and mental, erecting fences, watchtowers, and patrols, justified as protection against sinful intrusion, while inside, new rituals were introduced that bound members even closer to leadership, including confession circles where individuals were encouraged to publicly admit impure thoughts, doubts, or disobedience, sessions that often devolved into performative self-denunciation, as people competed to demonstrate humility, knowing that silence could be interpreted as concealment, and these rituals served a dual purpose, humiliating individuals while reinforcing group identity, ensuring that everyone was both watcher and watched, participant and enforcer, erasing the line between victim and accomplice. And as Hollow Grace entered its second decade, its population fluctuated not through birth and death, but through disappearance, with newcomers occasionally arriving, drawn by carefully curated testimonies and outward displays of harmony, while long-time members vanished in numbers large enough to alter labor rotations and housing assignments, yet never discussed openly, and it was during this period that Father Elijah withdrew from public view more frequently, delegating sermons to trusted elders while retreating into the sealed north wing of the chapel, a place no ordinary member was permitted to enter, rumored to house sacred texts, divine revelations, or preparation for the coming judgment, and though no one could say for certain what occurred behind those locked doors, the community felt its influence as policies grew harsher, punishments more severe, and mercy increasingly framed as weakness. And when children began to disappear, the community reached a turning point, though it did not recognize it as such at the time, because children, once symbols of hope and continuity, were reclassified as vessels of purity that required strict guidance, and those deemed spiritually flawed were removed for correction, sometimes returning weeks later altered and subdued, other times never returning at all, their absence explained as divine reclamation, a phrase so chilling in retrospect that it would later appear repeatedly in survivor testimonies, and by the time Hollow Grace had existed for nearly 20 years, the number of vanished individuals had grown into the hundreds, though no single person could account for all of them because memory itself had been fragmented, reshaped by years of controlled narrative, selective recall, and enforced silence, leaving behind a community that functioned smoothly on the surface while rotting from within, a place where faith had been weaponized, where love had been replaced by loyalty, and where the promise of salvation had become a justification for erasure. And yet, even as Hollow Grace tightened its grip, cracks were forming, small but dangerous, in the form of whispered doubts shared between trusted friends, in the hesitation of elders tasked with enforcing punishments they no longer believed were holy, in the questions of children who had not yet learned to fear curiosity, and it was these cracks, barely visible but growing, that would eventually allow the truth to seep through, because systems built on silence are always vulnerable to memory, and memory once awakened is impossible to fully contain. And as the settlement moved closer to its most violent and revealing years, the weight of every disappearance pressed heavier on the collective conscience, setting the stage for reckoning, for resistance, and for the unraveling of a secret that could no longer remain buried beneath hymns and prayer, because Hollow Grace had not merely lost people, it had consumed them, and the cost of that consumption was about to be paid in ways no sermon could explain. As the third decade of Hollow Grace began, the quiet fractures that had formed beneath years of enforced devotion finally deepened into fault lines. Though from the outside, the settlement appeared more orderly than ever, its fences freshly repaired, its chapel newly whitewashed, its hymns carried farther across the Kentucky hills than before, because Father Elijah understood something fundamental about control. When collapse approaches, beauty becomes camouflage, and so the rituals grew more elaborate, the sermons more poetic, the promises more vivid, even as the reality beneath them curdled into something irredeemable. And it was during this period that the concept of the Ledger of Souls was formally introduced, though few ever saw it with their own eyes, a book said to contain the spiritual status of every member, living or departed, a divine accounting that only the inner council could interpret, and the mere mention of the ledger created a chilling effect, because people understood that to fall out of favor was no longer just a social risk, but a metaphysical one, implying erasure not only from the community, but from salvation itself. And as whispers spread that names could be crossed out through persistent doubt or hidden sin, fear became absolute, driving people to extreme displays of loyalty, denouncing neighbors preemptively, confessing imagined transgressions to prove transparency, surrendering children to communal upbringing to demonstrate trust, and all of this fed directly into the machinery of disappearance. Because Father Elijah no longer needed to single anyone out, the community delivered its own, offering up the inconvenient, the questioning, the exhausted, under the belief that sacrifice preserved the whole, and those taken were escorted calmly, almost gently, into the chapel's lower chambers, told they were being prepared for a higher calling, a phrase repeated so often it lost all meaning. And while some were later seen laboring in distant fields or maintenance tunnels, many were never seen again, their absence explained as ascension, and the most insidious aspect of this system was how it redefined love, transforming it into a willingness to let go without grief, because grief itself was framed as selfish attachment, a failure to rejoice in God's will, and so parents learned to smile through loss, spouses learned to pray instead of weep, and friends learned to forget names that once filled their lives. And this emotional suppression created a numbness that allowed horrors to occur without resistance, because outrage requires feeling, and Hollow Grace had methodically starved its people of that capacity, replacing it with ritualized acceptance. And yet, beneath this cultivated serenity, terror festered, particularly among those tasked with enforcement, the guards and elders who escorted the chosen away, because proximity to truth corrodes belief, and they saw things others did not: empty rooms scrubbed too clean, bloodstains beneath new floorboards, clothing burned at night behind the chapel, and though they told themselves it was necessary, holy even, doubt crept in like rot beneath polished wood, and some began to drink secretly, others to suffer night terrors, others to vanish themselves after moments of hesitation, reinforcing the lesson that even enforcers were expendable. And during this same period, the outside world edged closer, not through dramatic intervention but through bureaucratic persistence, as county clerks noted discrepancies between census records and tax filings, as postal workers reported an unusual volume of undeliverable letters addressed to Hollow Grace, as travelers spoke of armed sentries and restricted roads, and eventually a young state investigator named Margaret Hale took interest, not driven by faith or fear but by numbers, because she noticed something simple and damning. Over 27 years, more than 300 individuals had been documented entering Hollow Grace, but fewer than half that number could be accounted for as living residents, with no corresponding death records, no burial permits, no transfers logged elsewhere, just a yawning statistical void. And though her initial inquiries were met with polite deflection, she persisted, requesting access to records, requesting interviews, requests that were delayed, redirected, or denied under claims of religious exemption. And inside Hollow Grace, these inquiries were reframed as prophecy fulfilled, with Father Elijah warning that the final test was approaching, that the faithful would soon be separated from the false. And this rhetoric triggered a final escalation, as the Ledger of Souls was invoked more frequently, as nightly prayers grew longer and more intense, as the north wing of the chapel remained lit through the night, casting an eerie glow AC. Ross the settlement, and it was then that the disappearances accelerated, not one by one but in clusters, entire families removed after being deemed spiritually compromised, children separated from parents, elders escorted away after decades of service, and the explanations grew thinner, less necessary, because by then silence itself had become obedience. And those who remained learned not to ask, not even inwardly, because thought had become the last refuge of rebellion, and rebellion was death. And yet, paradoxically, it was thought that finally began to resurface, sparked by small, uncontainable moments, like a child asking why God needed so many people taken away, or an elder hesitating during a sermon, or a guard refusing to escort a woman who reminded him of his sister, moments that shattered the illusion of inevitability, because inevitability depends on unquestioned momentum, and once momentum falters, systems collapse quickly. And it was during one such hesitation that a young woman named Ruth Calder slipped away, not taken but escaping, fleeing into the woods during a storm while the guards were distracted. Her disappearance, the first not sanctioned by the Ledger, and when she failed to return, panic rippled through leadership, because escape threatened exposure. And though Father Elijah preached that she had been reclaimed by the wilderness, his voice trembled for the first time, and Ruth's survival beyond the settlement, though unknown to most at the time, would later become the thread that unraveled everything, because she carried with her fragments of memory, names, rituals, places, enough to confirm what had long been suspected but never proven. And as Hollow Grace tightened its grip in response, instituting curfews, restricting movement, accelerating purification rites, it only hastened its own undoing, because fear-driven systems cannot tolerate leaks, and the effort to seal every crack often creates new ones. And by the time Margaret Hale returned with a court order, accompanied by deputies and medical personnel, Hollow Grace was already in a state of spiritual siege, its members exhausted, its leadership frantic, its rituals stripped of comfort and reduced to coercion. And though the gates were closed, the truth had already begun to escape, carried in whispers, in memories, in the growing unease of those who could no longer reconcile faith with disappearance, and as the hills echoed with hymns louder than ever, they could not drown out the approaching sound of reckoning, because no matter how deeply buried, secrets rot the soil above them, and hollow grace, built on devotion, twisted into control, was beginning to sink under the weight of its own vanished souls, each absence a debt unpaid, each silence a crack widening, drawing the settlement closer to a moment it could no longer pray away, when faith would be measured not by obedience, but by the undeniable evidence of lives erased, and the question that would finally be asked aloud: where did they all go, and who decided they should disappear? By the time the first frost settled over the Kentucky hills in the fourth phase of Hollow Grace's history, the settlement had already crossed a threshold from which there was no return, though few inside it yet understood that what they were living through was no longer merely devotion warped by fear, but a closed system actively feeding on itself, because Part 4 was the era in which disappearance became policy rather than con. Sequence, an era remembered later by survivors as the quiet years, not because peace reigned, but because silence was enforced so completely that even memory began to feel dangerous, and it was during these years that Father Elijah formalized the inner structure of control, establishing what he called the Circle of Witnesses, 12 men and women chosen not for compassion or wisdom, but for their capacity to endure moral contradiction, without breaking, individuals who could watch, record, and assist without asking why, and their task was to observe the spiritual temperature of the community, to listen for hesitation in prayer, to notice faltering voices in hymn, to mark those who lingered too long in private thought, because thought itself had been reframed as the birthplace of corruption, and the circle met weekly beneath the chapel in a windowless chamber where oil lamps smoked against stone walls, where Father Elijah would read passages from the Ledger of Souls, now a physical book bound in dark leather, its pages thick and uneven, its ink bleeding through like old wounds, and though no one outside the circle was permitted to see inside it, its presence alone exerted power, because people believed their names lived there, alive and vulnerable, subject to erasure, and once that belief took hold, behavior shifted dramatically, as neighbors began policing one another not out of malice but survival, because to report suspicion was to prove loyalty, and loyalty was the only currency left, and in this environment, disappearance no longer required overt force, because people began volunteering for purification, stepping forward to confess doubts real or imagined, hoping transparency would save them, not understanding that confession marked them more clearly than silence ever could, and those who confessed were thanked, embraced, prayed over, and then quietly escorted away, often at night, often without struggle, because they believed they were being healed, and the genius of this system, if such a word can be used for evil, was that it made the victims participants in their own removal, dissolving resistance at its root, and for those left behind, the pattern became familiar enough to dull alarm. Someone struggled, someone confessed, someone was purified, and then life continued. Meals cooked, fields tended, hymns sung, as if absence was simply another season, and yet beneath this normalized horror, cracks began to form, particularly among the children, who had not yet learned the careful discipline of emotional suppression, and who asked questions adults no longer dared to voice, questions like why God needed so many people to leave, or why mothers cried silently at night, or why the north wing of the chapel smelled of iron after storms, and these questions terrified the elders more than rebellion ever could, because curiosity spreads faster than anger, and so a new doctrine emerged, one focused on innocence as danger, teaching that children were especially vulnerable to corruption, their imaginations gateways for doubt, and under this doctrine, many children were separated from their families for communal protection, placed in dormitories overseen by the circle, where individuality was stripped away early, names replaced with numbers, birthdays erased, memories discouraged, and this severing of familial bonds served a dual purpose, weakening resistance while ensuring the next generation would know no life outside Hollow Grace, but Eve. This extreme measure could not fully suppress the unease growing within the ranks of those tasked with enforcement, because proximity to disappearance breeds an intimacy with fear that no doctrine can fully anesthetize, and several members of the circle began to show signs of strain, trembling hands, sleeplessness, sudden illness, and rather than being treated as symptoms of guilt, these were interpreted as proof of contamination, leading to a horrifying feedback loop in which enforcers themselves were purged, reinforcing the lesson that no one was immune, and this created an atmosphere of escalating paranoia, where loyalty had to be constantly performed, never assumed, and it was during this period that the physical landscape of Hollow Grace began to change in unsettling ways, with new structures appearing without explanation, ventilation shafts cut into hillsides, storage cellars sealed and resealed, paths rerouted to avoid certain clearings, and though official explanations cited agricultural expansion, the truth, pieced together later, suggested the creation of hidden spaces designed to process human absence efficiently, because disappearance on the scale Hollow Grace was now achieving required infrastructure, and infrastructure requires planning, and planning implies awareness, shattering any illusion that this was the unintended byproduct of misguided faith, and as the numbers grew, so too did the necessity of erasing evidence, leading to the establishment of ritualized burnings under the guise of seasonal cleansing, where clothing, personal effects, journals, even family photographs were destroyed, severing the last material connections between the vanished and the living, and this erasure extended into language itself, with words like gone, lost, and dead, banned from speech, replaced by the sanitized term ascended, a word repeated until it lost all meaning, and yet meaning has a way of leaking back in through the subconscious, and many residents reported dreams during this era, vivid and recurring, of voices calling from beneath the ground, of doors that could not be opened, of lists with names they recognized but could not read aloud, dreams that left them waking in terror but unable to articulate why, because even dreams were treated with suspicion, and to confess a troubling dream was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny often led to purification, and so people learned to swallow fear even in sleep, clenching their jaws until dawn, and while the internal machinery of Hollow Grace ground forward, the outside world continued to exist just beyond the hills, increasingly aware that something was wrong, though unable to articulate it clearly, because disappearance without bodies confounds systems designed to respond to crime, and local authorities, influenced by religious exemptions and political pressure, were reluctant to intervene, content to accept the community's explanations, until the numbers simply became impossible to ignore, because families outside Hollow Grace began asking questions, searching for relatives who had joined the settlement and then ceased contact entirely, letters returned unopened, visits denied, and though Father Elijah framed this isolation as spiritual necessity, it drew the attention of state officials concerned, less with theology and more with liability, and yet every inquiry was met with polished responses, meticulously maintained records that accounted for current residents, but said nothing of former ones, a bureaucratic sleight of hand made possible by the destruction of personal documentation within the community, and this disconnect between internal reality and external perception allowed Hollow Grace to persist far longer than it should have, because systems rely on evidence, and Hollow Grace specialized in erasing it, but erosion works both ways, and just as faith within the settlement had been hollowed out, so too had Father Elijah himself begun to fracture under the weight of his own creation, because control requires constant vigilance, and vigilance exhausts even the most fervent tyrant, and those close to him reported moments of distraction, slips in rhetoric, contradictions in doctrine, subtle but significant signs that the man at the center was no longer fully convinced of the narrative he preached, and this instability trickled downward, creating confusion among the circle, who depended on absolute certainty to justify their actions, and when certainty wavers, fear intensifies, leading to overcorrection, harsher purifications, more aggressive enforcement, because doubt cannot be permitted to exist, not even at the top. And so Part 4 culminated in what survivors would later call the Winter of Names, a period during which the ledger of souls was consulted almost nightly. Names crossed out at an unprecedented rate, entire lineages erased, and the pace of disappearance accelerated so dramatically that even the most conditioned residents could not keep track, leading to mistakes, contradictions, whispered realizations that the math no longer added up, that more people were leaving than arriving, that hollow grace was shrinking from the inside, and this realization planted a dangerous seed because it reframed disappearance, not as ascension, but consumption, raising the unspoken question of what exactly the community was feeding and whether it would ever be satisfied, and though no one yet dared to ask that question aloud, it hung heavy in the air, thickening the silence until it became unbearable, setting the stage for the fractures that would finally split hollow grace open in the parts to come, because systems built on disappearance eventually run out of people willing to disappear quietly. And when that moment arrives, control gives way to chaos, faith to fear, and silence to the kind of truth that can no longer be buried, no matter how deep the soil or how sacred the ground. As Part 5 began, the silence that had defined hollow grace in the previous years did not break all at once, but began to warp, stretching thin in places where fear could no longer contain itself, because the Winter of Names had left behind a residue that could not be scrubbed away by prayer or ritual, and that residue was arithmetic, the most dangerous form of truth in a place built on spiritual abstraction, for people had begun, quietly and independently, to count, not aloud and not together, but in their own minds, counting empty beds, unused plates, shoes left by doors that would never be worn again, and these private calculations all led to the same unspoken conclusion. Hollow grace was consuming itself faster than it could replenish, and in a community that believed survival was proof of divine favor, this imbalance was terrifying, because it suggested either that God's appetite was limitless, or that someone was lying about what God wanted, and into this tension stepped Father Elijah with a new revelation, announced not from the PU. Pit, but delivered house to house by the remaining members of the Circle of Witnesses, a revelation that reframed disappearance not as punishment or purification, but as harvest, declaring that hollow grace had entered its season of offering, a sacred cycle in which the community must willingly give itself back to the divine in preparation for an imminent transformation. And the brilliance of this lie lay in its finality, because it implied an ending, and people exhausted by years of fear are vulnerable to any promise that suggests suffering will soon conclude, and so for a brief and fragile moment, hope returned, twisted and desperate, but real enough to dull resistance, as Father Elijah spoke of a coming great sealing, after which no one would ever leave again, because there would be no need, and those who remained would inherit a perfected world cleansed of doubt, and this promise shifted the tone of enforcement dramatically, because rather than rooting out dissent, the circle now focused on accelerating the offering, identifying those deemed ripe, a word that began appearing in sermons and prayers, its agricultural familiarity masking its violence, and those labeled ripe were often the elderly, the sick, the chronically fearful, or those who had already lost family to disappearance, individuals whose emotional reserves were depleted, and these people were approached with gentleness rather than accusation, told they had been chosen for their strength, their sacrifice necessary for the sealing to occur, and many accepted this role willingly, not because they believed it fully, but because belief had become less important than relief. And the idea of choosing their end felt preferable to waiting for it, and so disappearances increased again, but with less resistance, fewer tears, fewer questions, and this outward calm concealed an inner rot, because not everyone accepted the new doctrine, and among those who did not were several of the younger adults who had grown up entirely within hollow grace, but retained faint memories of a world beyond its borders, memories triggered by forbidden scraps of paper, by half-remembered songs, by the strange pull of roads that led away from the settlement, and these individuals began to recognize the season of offering for what it was, an acceleration toward annihilation, and unlike previous dissenters, they did not confess, because they had learned confession was simply another doorway to erasure, and instead they began to observe quietly, sharing information in fragments, glances, coded phrases slipped into mundane conversation, building a fragile underground awareness that something irreversible was approaching. And this awareness coalesced around a single terrifying idea, that the Great Sealing was not a spiritual transformation but a logistical one, a point at which hollow grace would close itself entirely, severing all remaining ties to the outside world, leaving no witnesses, no survivors, no one to ask where the missing had gone. And evidence for this theory emerged in the form of construction, as new barriers were erected along the perimeter, gates reinforced, paths blocked, watch rotations increased, and though these measures were framed as protection against external corruption, their inward-facing nature suggested containment rather than defense. And it was during this time that rumors began to circulate about the North Quarry, a limestone pit long abandoned due to flooding, which had recently been drained and reinforced, and though access was restricted, workers assigned to the area returned changed, silent, their eyes avoiding contact, and one of them, a man named Caleb, who had lost 2 sisters to the ledger years earlier, finally broke, whispering to a friend that the quarry was not being prepared for storage or mining but for something else entirely, something vast and permanent, and though he refused to say more, his fear spoke loudly enough, and shortly after, Caleb was labeled ripe and escorted away, confirming what many already suspected, that the community was nearing a point of no return, and as pressure mounted, cracks began to form within the circle itself, because while some members embraced the season of offering with renewed fervor, others struggled to reconcile it with earlier teachings, noting contradictions too severe to ignore, and these internal conflicts manifested as delays, missed meetings, altered records, small acts of sabotage that slowed the machinery of disappearance just enough to create friction. And Father Elijah noticed, because he noticed everything, and his response was swift and merciless, dissolving the circle of witnesses entirely and replacing it with a smaller, more secretive inner council drawn from his most loyal followers, individuals whose devotion bordered on fanaticism, and this restructuring marked a turning point, because it eliminated even the illusion of communal oversight, concentrating power completely in Father Elijah's hands, and with that consolidation came a shift in tone, sermons growing harsher, language more apocalyptic, emphasizing urgency and obedience over understanding, and fear returned, sharper and more volatile than before, because hope had been dangled and then snatched away, and people who had begun to believe in an ending now realized the ending might include them, and this realization sparked the first true acts of resistance Hollow Grace had seen in years, not organized rebellion but individual refusals, people failing to appear for prayer, hiding children, sabotaging records, acts small enough to avoid immediate detection but significant enough to disrupt the narrative of willing offering, and these disruptions enraged Father Elijah, because they threatened not only control but the story he had built to justify everything that had come before, and his response escalated dramatically, instituting public purifications for the first time, ceremonies conducted in the chapel where those accused of resisting the harvest were brought forward, questioned, prayed over, and then taken away in full view of the congregation, a deliberate spectacle designed to reassert dominance through terror. And while these displays temporarily restored order, they also shattered any remaining illusions, because fear witnessed collectively behaves differently than fear endured privately, and the congregation could now see the machinery at work, the way people were selected, the way explanations shifted, the way compassion was weaponized, and this visibility planted a seed of collective awareness that could not be erased. And it was during one such ceremony that a young woman named Ruth did something unthinkable, stepping forward unbidden and asking a single question, spoken calmly but loud enough for all to hear: if the harvest was nearly complete, why did it require so many more names? And the silence that followed was catastrophic, because for the first time Father Elijah did not have an immediate answer, and that pause, brief as it was, rippled through the room like a shockwave, because authority in Hollow Grace depended on immediacy, on certainty delivered without hesitation, and that moment of delay exposed the man behind the doctrine, fallible, calculating, afraid. And though Ruth was seized and removed within seconds, her question lingered, echoing in the minds of those who heard it, because it articulated what many had felt but could not voice. And from that point on, the story of Hollow Grace began to fracture irreparably as people started watching Father Elijah not as a prophet, but as a man guarding a collapsing structure. And this shift in perception weakened the spell he had cast, because belief, once broken, does not mend easily. And as the season of offering dragged on with no great ceiling in sight, patience thinned, suspicion grew, and the underground awareness transformed into quiet preparation, people memorizing routes, hiding supplies, teaching children forbidden knowledge about the world beyond the hills, not yet ready to flee but no longer willing to vanish. And though these preparations remained fragmented, lacking coordination, they represented something Hollow Grace had not seen in decades, the will to survive outside its boundaries, and this will, fragile and desperate, set the stage for the inevitable confrontation between control and escape, faith and fear, silence and truth, because by the end of Part 5, it had become clear that Hollow Grace was approaching its most dangerous moment, not when belief was strongest, but when it began to fail, because a community built on disappearance can endure only as long as people believe there is a reason to disappear, and once that reason is questioned, even in whispers, the entire structure begins to collapse inward, pulling everyone with it, and whether that collapse would result in liberation or annihilation was a question that hung unanswered in the cold Kentucky air, waiting for the reckoning yet to come. Part 6 of Hollow Grace's history opened in a tense equilibrium, the kind that exists just before a storm, when the air feels heavier, the shadows longer, and every creak of floorboards carries a message of warning, because the fractures seeded in Part 5 had begun to multiply, subtle at first, then undeniable, as the collective awareness of the congregation continued to shift, from passive obedience to quiet calculation, from unthinking fear to whispered curiosity. And though Father Elijah attempted to reassert control with increasingly elaborate rituals, the effectiveness of his commands waned, because once belief is strained by repeated contradictions, the human mind starts to see gaps, inconsistencies, and eventually, opportunities. During this period, the so-called quiet resistance gained momentum. It was not organized in the sense of open defiance. Any overt rebellion in Hollow Grace meant disappearance, but it manifested in subtler ways. Children were hidden during inspections, notes were slipped under doors with instructions on routes through the forest, and elders whispered cautionary tales about people who ascended too early, stories designed to instill skepticism in younger generations. Every act of survival required absolute discretion, because the circle of witnesses, though smaller and more secretive, was relentless. Members were trained to detect hesitation, facial micro-expressions, even the cadence of breathing, as signals of internal rebellion. Yet despite this surveillance, the system could not fully contain the undercurrent of defiance, because fear can enforce action but never fully eradicate thought. Father Elijah, sensing the instability, introduced a new layer of doctrine, emphasizing an impending test, the Great Trial, an event that would decide who among the community was worthy to remain and who would be offered early. Sermons became increasingly theatrical, blending scripture with what later investigators would describe as psychological manipulation bordering on terror, and residents were forced to participate in nightly rites that tested obedience, endurance, and submission. These trials often took the form of grueling physical tasks under emotional duress, where participants had to endure humiliation, sleep deprivation, and forced confessions, all while the rest of the community observed. The spectacle served a dual purpose. It reinforced hierarchy, and it desensitized the population to the disappearances that had become routine, because once the mind is trained to accept suffering as normal, the removal of neighbors becomes a continuation of a ritual rather than an alarming event. Yet the more elaborate the rituals, the more cracks appeared. Internal correspondence, hushed conversations, coded messages, and written notes exchanged in secrecy revealed that many were beginning to question the legitimacy of the Ledger of Souls, the book that had once been the ultimate authority in determining fate. Rumors swirled that names were being altered or fabricated, that some individuals were being ascended, not because of spiritual purity, but because of administrative convenience or the whims of the council. This realization, even if fragmentary, was enough to seed doubt widely, because doubt in hollow grace was contagious. One questioning glance, one whispered suspicion, could ripple outward, undermining decades of enforced obedience. At the same time, logistical pressures were mounting. With each disappearance, there were fewer people to maintain the physical infrastructure of the settlement: fields, buildings, storage areas, and hidden chambers. The quarry, now an enormous underground space reinforced and expanded, was filling steadily with the physical traces of those removed. And yet the residents were discouraged from thinking of it as a graveyard or prison. It was described instead as a sacred holding place, part of the preparation for the Great Sealing. Few dared to ask what exactly this preparation entailed, because even speculation was punished. The dissonance between language and reality became ever more apparent, yet the doctrine demanded full compliance. During Part 6, the children of Hollow Grace, who had now reached adolescence, became the focal point of tension. They had been indoctrinated in isolation, yet their innate curiosity and memory of fragments from the outside world made them resistant to complete erasure. Teachers and elders began reporting unusual behaviors, questions about who had disappeared, attempts to memorize routes through hidden exits, and secret gatherings where forbidden stories were told. This generation represented both a threat and a potential salvation, because if the children could organize or escape, they could carry knowledge beyond the settlement's borders. Conversely, if they failed, they would serve as the next generation of enforcers, ensuring the cycle of disappearance continued. Father Elijah, aware of the emerging threat posed by the youth, intensified the indoctrination. Lessons were rewritten to emphasize obedience and the holiness of the harvest. Music and hymns incorporated subtle cues, conditioning children to associate doubt with danger and compliance with divine favor. Punishments for minor infractions grew harsher, serving both as deterrent and spectacle. Yet, paradoxically, these measures only confirmed to the older, secretly observant members that something within Hollow Grace had shifted irreversibly. The system was overcorrecting, its own extremity was fueling the resistance it sought to suppress. In the midst of this tension, a group of adults, those who had witnessed the disappearances firsthand and had survived multiple purifications, began communicating secretly to map patterns. The timing of purifications, the rotation of the circle, the individuals consistently deemed ripe. This clandestine intelligence gathering became an underground science of survival. They observed that disappearances were not entirely random, but followed subtle patterns tied to obedience scores, visibility within the community, and perceived usefulness. By decoding these signals, the observant could predict potential targets and take precautionary measures, hiding children or temporarily removing themselves from public duties. These were small victories, but each one was significant, demonstrating that Hollow Grace's ultimate control had limits, that the machinery of fear could be anticipated and, in some cases, circumvented. Moreover, the psychological toll on the circle itself began to accelerate. Members who had once been infallible enforcers of doctrine exhibited lapses in judgment, hesitation, and even empathy, leading to inconsistent enforcement of rules. Some were overcome with guilt, secretly aiding those they were supposed to monitor. Others, terrified of being labeled impure themselves, became ruthless in overcompensation, escalating punishments in a futile attempt to stabilize a system already eroding. This internal decay, largely hidden from the general congregation, created openings for strategic action by those seeking survival. It was in these gaps that the first true seeds of collective strategy were sown, though no one could yet fully articulate the plan. The spatial dimension of Hollow Grace also evolved dramatically during this phase. The quarry, which had begun as a functional site, was expanded into a labyrinthine subterranean network, complete with ventilation shafts, storage chambers, and hidden corridors. Access was strictly controlled, and even members of the circle required permission to enter. Yet rumors of activity, voices echoing in the tunnels at odd hours, lights flickering through narrow slits, and glimpses of figures moving under lantern glow, circulated, further heightening fear and speculation. Many residents believed these tunnels were part of the ultimate purification process, while others suspected the worst, that the vanished were not merely removed, but imprisoned in ways that denied them any hope of return. Another important development of Part 6 was the arrival of the external inspectors. State officials and local magistrates, previously discouraged from questioning Hollow Grace's internal affairs, began to push for oversight due to mounting reports from families outside the settlement. These visits were carefully staged, with Father Elijah presenting an illusion of order and piety, guiding inspectors through the fields, showing communal meals, and highlighting ritual compliance. The quarry and ledger were never disclosed, of course, and yet the presence of outsiders, even temporary, created ripple effects within the population. Residents realized that the world outside had begun to look in, and for the first time the possibility of exposure became tangible. This awareness injected a new urgency into the secret preparations quietly unfolding among those who doubted, because escape or revelation had now become viable concepts, even if terrifyingly risky. Amidst this, a key theme emerged: the intersection of fear and hope. The community had long been dominated by fear, structured around the certainty of disappearance and divine judgment. But as cracks widened, through youth curiosity, circle hesitation, and clandestine observations, the faintest glimmer of hope began to emerge. It was fragile, manifesting as careful planning, subtle questioning, and mental exercises imagining life beyond Hollow Grace. This psychological shift was critical, for it meant that while physical control remained near total, spiritual and intellectual obedience had already begun to falter. The winter of names, the season of offering, the great trial, and the fracturing of faith and control all converged in Part 6 to create an environment where every act, no matter how small, had amplified consequences. A whispered question, a hidden route memorized, or a suppressed cry could cascade into events that would alter the fate of the entire community. Hollow Grace, for all its meticulous structure, now operated on the edge of chaos. Those inside were beginning to realize that their lives, once thought to be wholly dictated by divine or human authority, were influenced by patterns they could detect and, potentially, exploit. Thus, Part 6 closed with a sense of impending transformation. Hollow Grace was no longer a simple site of ritualized disappearance. It had become a living system with vulnerabilities that insiders were only beginning to perceive. The balance of power had shifted subtly but irrevocably. The machinery of fear was still strong, but the seeds of resistance were sown deeply, and as the community approached the next phase, it was clear that the coming period would test every facet of human endurance, ingenuity, and courage, setting the stage for a reckoning that would determine whether Hollow Grace could survive, or whether its carefully maintained illusion would finally collapse under the weight of its own horrors. The people of Hollow Grace, conditioned for decades to obey without question, were beginning to understand that survival required more than faith. It required observation, collaboration, and audacity, and by the end of Part 6, even the most obedient were secretly calculating, preparing mentally for the possibility that the world outside their limestone walls might one day become the only sanctuary left. Part 7 of Hollow Grace's history began as a tense and fragile continuum of the cracks that had appeared in Part 6, and it is here that the very architecture of fear, control, and obedience was tested against the first true currents of organized, though hidden, defiance. The residents, particularly those who had survived multiple cycles of disappearance and ritualized punishment, began to recognize a fundamental truth. The system, no matter how meticulously crafted by Father Elijah and the Circle, was not infallible. They had learned to read patterns, memorize the subtle inconsistencies in scheduling and behavior, and exploit the gaps in oversight that even the most rigid hierarchy could not completely eliminate. By the time Part 7 began, Hollow Grace had transformed from a monolith of terror into a dynamic system of layered controls, contradictions, and quietly evolving resistance, and the stage was set for a confrontation whose scope would extend beyond the physical confines of the limestone walls and into the psychological and spiritual framework that had bound the community for decades. The initial months of this period were dominated by intensified indoctrination. Father Elijah, sensing the subtle tremors of doubt, and noticing the emboldened curiosity among the youth and hesitant circle members, doubled down on ritualistic extremities. Sermons became even more theatrical, blending moral allegory with vivid depictions of divine retribution for those who dared question authority. The great trial, which had previously been a looming spectre, was now operationalized as a series of evaluations that combined physical endurance, emotional composure, and forced public confessions of minor and imagined transgressions. The effect was twofold. Outwardly, it created a spectacle that reminded the community of the omnipresence of divine scrutiny. Inwardly, it heightened fear among those still entirely obedient, while simultaneously revealing the cracks in the system to those paying close attention. Amid these trials, the clandestine network of resistance continued to grow. Small pockets of observant adults, including former circle members disillusioned by guilt and overwork, coordinated in absolute secrecy. They devised methods for passing information through seemingly innocuous means. The pattern of laundry hung on lines, the placement of candles during evening prayers, and the coded arrangement of herbs in the communal kitchen became a language of survival, enabling covert communication between individuals who could not speak openly without risking immediate disappearance. These methods, developed over years of subtle observation, demonstrated the ingenuity of human adaptability under extreme oppression. Resistance had become an intellectual exercise as much as a physical one, requiring memory, patience, and calculated risk. One significant development in Part 7 was the role of the adolescents. By now, many had reached ages where their curiosity and growing cognitive independence made them not just participants but potential catalysts for change. Several had memorized the hidden corridors of the quarry, routes through the forest, and the schedules of the circle. Others had begun to question the logic behind the disappearances, wondering why obedience alone did not guarantee survival, and whether the ledger of souls truly reflected divine will or human whim. These observations were dangerous, but they were critical to the evolution of the underground network. Leaders among the youth emerged quietly, teaching the youngest how to avoid detection, encouraging them to memorize exits, and instilling the importance of secrecy and observation. Over time, the adolescents became the eyes and ears of the resistance, gathering critical intelligence that would later inform decisions of life and death. Meanwhile, Father Elijah's efforts to maintain absolute control began to show signs of strain. The circle, which had once enforced unwavering obedience, now contained members whose loyalties were conflicted. Some were overtly ruthless, seeking to reassert dominance through intimidation. Others hesitated, allowing minor deviations from protocol to go unnoticed. This inconsistency created an unpredictable environment in which even those entirely loyal to the system could no longer be certain of safety. The machinery of fear, while still functional, was now operating under human limitations. Fatigue, guilt, and the subtle influence of empathy had introduced variables that could not be fully managed. The quarry itself, central to the culture of disappearance, became increasingly symbolic of both oppression and potential liberation. The labyrinthine network of tunnels, hidden chambers, and reinforced holding areas reflected the meticulous planning of the circle, yet the very complexity that had made it a tool of control now became a vulnerability. Observant residents began to map its interior in secret, noting blind corners, weak passages, and ventilation shafts that could be exploited in emergencies. Over the course of Part 7, the quarry evolved from a static instrument of fear into a dynamic space of possibility. It was both a prison and a potential escape route, a duality that underscored the shifting balance of power within Hollow Grace. Amid these physical and strategic developments, a psychological transformation was underway. Residents were beginning to internalize a paradoxical understanding: survival required outward compliance, yet inner defiance was essential. This duality was mentally taxing, demanding constant vigilance, careful observation, and the suppression of instinctual fear. Many developed techniques for compartmentalizing thought and emotion, allowing them to participate in public rituals without revealing internal skepticism. This mental discipline became critical because any hint of doubt could trigger investigation and potential disappearance. Over time, these skills became cultural knowledge, passed discreetly from one generation to the next, ensuring that resistance could endure even under extreme duress. Another critical feature of Part 7 was the analysis of the disappearance patterns themselves. The underground network, having survived multiple cycles, realized that the selection of individuals for purification or removal was not entirely random. Observers noted subtle cues in behavior, positioning during ceremonies, and frequency of speech, all of which correlated with removal events. This predictive understanding allowed the cautious to take preemptive measures. Children could be moved to safer locations, adults could feign obedience, and critical knowledge could be preserved in hidden caches. The study of these patterns became an unspoken science within Hollow Grace, combining intuition, observation, and deductive reasoning. Concurrently, tensions within the community were exacerbated by the arrival of external interest. Local officials, merchants, and neighboring residents had begun to notice anomalies in Hollow Grace's behavior, prompting inquiries that were politely deflected by Father Elijah through staged rituals and controlled demonstrations of prosperity and order. While these interactions were brief and heavily supervised, they introduced a new psychological element. The residents now understood that the world beyond the limestone walls was not entirely absent or indifferent. The potential for exposure created both hope and additional risk, as missteps in secrecy could lead to immediate and irreversible consequences. The interpersonal dynamics during Part 7 were equally revealing. Relationships among the youth, elders, and former circle members became intensely layered, blending mentorship, strategic alliance, and subtle power struggles. Trust, already a rare commodity, had to be earned through demonstrated loyalty, careful observation, and the sharing of critical knowledge. Betrayal, whether intentional or inadvertent, could result in disappearance or manipulation by the circle. Social cohesion, once maintained primarily through fear, now depended on mutual calculation and the ability to read micro-expressions, body language, and unspoken cues. This delicate social balance created an atmosphere in which every interaction carried weight, and even seemingly mundane acts, sharing a meal, walking together through a corridor, or exchanging a glance during prayer, could have life or death implications. By the midpoint of Part 7, a crucial turning point emerged, the recognition that survival could not be solely reactive. Passive endurance was insufficient. It had to be coupled with calculated initiative. Residents who had once relied solely on avoidance and secrecy began to experiment with small, controlled acts of agency, hiding children in reinforced chambers, leaving misleading traces for the circle, and rehearsing escape plans during periods when surveillance was minimal. These actions were perilous yet necessary, marking the transition from quiet endurance to active resistance. The psychological liberation that accompanied even minor successes in these efforts reinforced the growing understanding that Hollow Grace, for all its design, was not omnipotent. Another layer of complexity was introduced by the emotional toll of prolonged fear and observation. Long-term exposure to the constant threat of disappearance, combined with the rigorous mental training required to maintain secrecy, resulted in psychological adaptations that varied widely among residents. Some developed hypervigilance and acute observational skills, enhancing their ability to detect subtle cues and deviations from expected behavior. Others became desensitized, their emotional responses dulled as a protective mechanism, allowing them to perform rituals mechanically while internally questioning the system. These adaptations, while critical for survival, also created friction, as differing coping strategies could lead to miscommunication and mistrust within the underground network. During this phase, a significant narrative emerged regarding the legacy of disappeared individuals. Residents began documenting, in secret, the names, habits, and locations of those removed. These clandestine records, maintained in hidden manuscripts and coded notations, served as a repository of memory and evidence, ensuring that the vanished were not entirely erased from the communal consciousness. This act of remembrance carried both practical and symbolic significance. It allowed future generations to understand patterns of control, anticipate potential threats, and cultivate a cultural memory resistant to the manipulations of the circle. The ledger of souls, once the unassailable arbiter of fate, was now complemented by an underground record, undermining its perceived omnipotence. As Part 7 drew to a close, the interplay between control and defiance reached a point of critical tension. Father Elijah remained outwardly dominant, performing rituals with increasing intensity, yet the underlying social, psychological, and strategic transformations within Hollow Grace had created conditions in which absolute authority was no longer achievable. The residents, particularly those involved in the clandestine network, had developed the skills, knowledge, and psychological resilience necessary to navigate the perils of their environment with calculated precision. They had learned to observe, to memorize, to strategize, and to resist subtly but persistently. In essence, Part 7 documented the evolution of Hollow Grace from a rigidly controlled environment into a complex adaptive system, one in which fear remained a powerful tool but no longer guaranteed obedience. The subterranean tunnels, coded communications, observant youth, conflicted circle members, and secret records collectively represented a growing counterforce, capable of undermining the carefully constructed illusions of absolute power. The stage was now set for Part 8, where the culmination of decades of fear, observation, and clandestine preparation would meet the ultimate challenge, testing whether the seeds of resistance could survive the impending trial of revelation, exposure, and the potential collapse of Hollow Grace's meticulously maintained order. Part 8 opens on the cusp of revelation, where the accumulated tension, secrecy, and quiet resistance cultivated over decades in Hollow Grace were about to confront their ultimate test. By this point, the residents, adults, former circle members, and the older adolescents who had grown into strategic observers had transformed the very mechanisms of fear into tools of survival. The tunnels beneath the limestone walls, once instruments of absolute control, had become a network of clandestine passageways, allowing the community to maneuver, gather intelligence, and anticipate the next wave of disappearances. In essence, Hollow Grace had become a living organism, adaptive and responsive, where every corridor, hidden chamber, and whispered code held the potential to shift the balance of power. The stakes had never been higher, because the Circle's authority, though still outwardly imposing, was now operating in an environment thick with uncertainty, careful observation, and subtle subversion. The first challenge that emerged in Part 8 was logistical. The community had to prepare for what they began to call the reckoning, a term whispered among the underground network to describe the inevitable confrontation between authority and resistance. Every resident who had survived previous cycles of control now recognized that endurance alone would not secure safety. Proactive strategy was essential. Meetings in hidden rooms, often under the pretext of routine chores or prayers, became planning sessions. Maps of tunnels, notes on patrol rotations, and schedules of ceremonies were meticulously analyzed. Adolescents who had once been mere observers became key strategists, leveraging their intimate knowledge of daily routines and hidden alcoves to chart potential escape routes or hide vulnerable individuals. This preparation was not merely practical, it was psychological, instilling a sense of agency and hope that had been largely absent for decades. At the same time, the Circle intensified their rituals, sensing a disruption in the equilibrium of obedience. Father Elijah, aware of subtle defiance and inconsistencies in loyalty, implemented increasingly elaborate purification ceremonies, combining endurance tests with forced confessions and public examinations of faith. The community was forced to perform in highly visible, emotionally draining displays designed to reinforce the illusion of absolute control. Yet, paradoxically, these displays provided the underground network with critical intelligence. Observing which circle members hesitated, which adolescents watched too closely, and which rituals contained vulnerabilities, allowed the resistance to refine their strategies in real time. Every ritual became both a trap and a lens through which the hidden dynamics of power could be studied. Part 8 also delves into the human consequences of decades of secrecy and fear. The residents' mental and emotional adaptations were pushed to the limit. Hypervigilance, which had once been a survival tool, now required near-constant maintenance. Mistimed movements, misplaced glances, or emotional responses risked triggering investigation or disappearance. Yet, within this constant tension, the community discovered an unexpected cohesion. Mutual reliance became an unspoken law. Those who had once endured in silence now shared information selectively, mentored younger members in the arts of concealment, and provided emotional support. Bonds forged under such extreme conditions were profound, and they created a web of interdependence that even the circle could not fully penetrate. A pivotal moment in Part 8 was the analysis of disappearance patterns over the previous decades. Through painstaking observation and secret record-keeping, the underground network had discerned a method to the apparent madness. The circle's selections were influenced not only by obedience, but by perception of potential threat to authority, subtle acts of questioning, and occasionally personal vendettas within the ranks. By recognizing these patterns, the residents could anticipate danger and implement defensive strategies, such as relocating children, manipulating schedules, or creating diversions. This newfound predictive capability shifted the balance. The circle could still enforce fear, but the underground network had gained the first true leverage over the mechanisms of control. The quarry tunnels, long a symbol of terror, now became a stage for the final confrontations. Hidden chambers were reinforced, escape passages were mapped and memorized, and observation posts were established to monitor circle movements. These tunnels were no longer merely a site of punishment, they were an instrument of empowerment, allowing residents to act strategically and anticipate threats with precision. Adolescents played critical roles, guiding adults through secret passages and using their familiarity with the labyrinthine corridors to relay messages, scout for patrols, and provide early warning systems. Over time, these tunnels, previously a place of despair, became a living blueprint of resistance. The emotional weight of this final phase cannot be overstated. The residents were aware that exposure, whether to the outside world or to the circle, carried the gravest consequences. Yet in Part 8, fear was coupled with a calculated courage born of decades of adaptation. Individuals had learned to compartmentalize their emotions, to present outward obedience while internally strategizing, and to use observation and intuition as survival tools. Each resident became a node in a larger system, where the smallest action, misdirection, a whispered warning, or a subtle alteration of ritual, could influence the survival of dozens. The collective intelligence of the community, developed in secrecy over decades, was now reaching its peak potential. One of the most striking developments in this period was the confrontation between human ingenuity and the illusion of omnipotence maintained by the circle. Father Elijah and his inner circle, confident in their long-standing dominance, were unprepared for the coordinated subtlety of the underground network. Small acts of deception, false trails, manipulated cues, and stage compliance cumulatively undermined the circle's authority. What had once appeared as a system of absolute control was revealed as a brittle construct, dependent on obedience, fear, and the suppression of human curiosity and initiative. The residents had effectively weaponized their understanding of these dependencies, turning the very instruments of oppression into means of survival and subtle resistance. As Part 8 progressed, the question of legacy emerged. Residents recognized that the knowledge accumulated over decades, tunnel maps, disappearance patterns, coded communication methods, and observation protocols, was a form of cultural inheritance. Preserving this knowledge became a priority, ensuring that future generations could navigate the same environment with greater agency and insight. Hidden journals, coded songs, and secret symbols were established as methods for transmitting this wisdom, reinforcing the concept that survival depended not merely on compliance, but on the careful stewardship of information. The community, once trapped entirely within the dictates of fear, had now begun shaping its own history and collective memory. Amid these preparations and strategic maneuvers, the residents also confronted profound moral and psychological questions. How far should they manipulate the rituals and appearances to ensure safety? What responsibilities did they hold to those still completely subservient or unaware of the underground network? How could they balance survival with maintaining a sense of humanity in a system designed to strip it away? These questions, once abstract, became operational, informing each decision who to hide, how to mislead, when to act and when to wait. The moral calculus of survival became as critical as the physical and tactical planning, reinforcing the complexity of life within Hollow Grace. By the closing chapters of Part 8, Hollow Grace had evolved into a community defined not by fear alone, but by intelligence, strategy, and subtle solidarity. Fear remained as it always would, but it no longer dictated action without contest. The residents had learned to read, predict, and influence outcomes with a precision that the Circle could not fully anticipate. The labyrinth of tunnels, hidden chambers, and secret communication networks represented the community's adaptation, a testament to resilience and ingenuity in the face of decades of systematic oppression. The culmination of these developments set the stage for the ultimate revelation. The residents were poised not only to survive but to assert agency, challenge the illusion of absolute authority, and reclaim their existence from a system that had sought to erase them. Ultimately, Part 8 is the story of transformation. It is the chronicle of a community that turned terror into strategy, invisibility into intelligence, and fear into a tool for survival. Over decades, the residents of Hollow Grace had adapted mentally, emotionally, and physically, creating a layered, resilient network capable of surviving extreme control and, for the first time, capable of shaping its destiny. The limestone walls, the tunnels, the circle, and the rituals all were revealed to be mutable constructs, subject to human ingenuity, observation, and courage. What began as a society dominated by fear concluded with the emergence of strategic resilience, a blueprint for survival under oppression that would endure far beyond the next cycle of ritual or disappearance. As the story closes, the narrative encourages reflection on the resilience of the human spirit, the power of observation and adaptation, and the ways in which seemingly insurmountable systems of control can be challenged from within. Hollow Grace stands as a chilling but instructive example of how fear, when met with intelligence, strategy, and quiet solidarity, can be mitigated and transformed into the means of survival. And so, with the stage set for potential liberation and the legacy of knowledge preserved for the generations to come, Part 8 completes the arc of this harrowing tale, leaving viewers to grapple with both the horror of the past and the remarkable resilience of those who endured it. Before we conclude, remember to subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment sharing how shocking and intense you found this story. The legacy of Hollow Grace, the vanished and the resilient survivors, is now part of history, and by engaging with it, you ensure these stories are never forgotten.